And welcome to the lecture number 54. That's 5-4. I'm very impressed of all of you that lasted through the first book. And the depth, Rambam is going to be diving deeper and deeper into this this discussion of the proofs. Remember, he ended the last book by bringing the proofs that the religious scholars of his day, the Islamic scholars, the Mutakalamun, used to prove the three most important philosophical principles. That number one, that God is one. Number two, that God is not corporeal. And number three, that there was a creation and a creator, right? So those were the three facts. Now, Rambam is going to tell us the Aristotle's view, or what would correspond, what we would call today the scientific view, right? So a few words. So we're going to start book 2. So we're in volume 2 in the bluish, greenish, I don't know what color this is, one. It's and of the Pints version. We're going to do the introduction. And I'll always have the Hebrew Kapach in front of me as well, because he has really great notes. And sometimes his translation is better, and sometimes the English translation is better. But anyway, there's a few remarkable things that I want to point out before we even begin. But we have to understand that Rambam is about to embark on a summary of physics of his day, right? He's trying to prove God, right? He's trying to prove those three important things that we just discussed and demonstrate what the proper Jewish view is. That's the end game here, is what the proper Jewish, what he considers the Torah view or the Jewish view or his view, okay? And before he does that, he brings other religions, and then he brings science. Now, he doesn't use the term science. Remember, Rambam used two terms called physics and metaphysics, which he called Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava. Maaseh Bereshit in Rambam's mind means physics, and Maaseh Merkava is metaphysics. And that corresponds to Aristotle's terms as well. Now, both in Aristotle's vision and the way Rambam understood Aristotle, both of those things are actual physical scientific realities. It's not like today people think there's a physical world and a spiritual world, right? Rambam doesn't have such that same kind of differentiation. These are all actual, real, scientifically, in theory, somehow verifiable, real entities, actual things. So when Rambam refers to an intellect, right, it's a force, it's something that's out there that does things that's actual and real. It's scientifically measurable. We might not have a something to measure it with. It's just important to keep that in mind. And the other thing is that, this is what's truly remarkable, is that the concept, or to the idea to the Rambam of somebody saying that you should study only Torah and not science would be completely and utterly absurd to Rambam, right? To say something like that would be just an absurd statement. You cannot understand anything unless you know the world, unless you understand God's world, Maaseh Bereshit. So Rambam has to give us these pointers, which he's about to give us, so that we can understand the process by which Aristotle came to his conclusions. And then we'll be able to understand how Rambam argues with one of the main ones, that main conclusion being the idea that according to Aristotle, the world is eternal. It's always been and always will be. And whereas according to the Rambam and according to the Torah, there's a point of creation. The Creator created the world ex nihilo, yesh me'ayin. That's where Rambam is going to lead to his disagreement with Aristotle. So now, so in this introduction, he's going to summarize 25/26, and you'll see why I say that, premises upon which Aristotle builds all of his conclusions. Okay, so and this is a summary of these ideas, which, according to Fine's notes on the bottom, there's no other person that had done this until Rambam's time. Rambam was very good, and he loved to take lots and lots of things and crystallize them and list. Okay, there's 10 things, right? So here he's going to say 25. Now, Now, we're about to learn some physics that are very, very different from the physics that any of us learned when we were in high school or college or graduate school, whatever level of physics education anyone listening here has. This is going to sound very different, but this at the time of the Rambam was physics. And I want to make one other point before I start, and that is that even though this science is extremely outdated, I promise you that as we see how the Rambam applies this science to the Torah, it will give you a tremendous amount of insight into how you should apply the science that you know to be true when you're studying the Torah. And that's a really crucial point. And there are many places where Rambam indicates that he knows and understands that this science isn't perfect and things might change. But he dealt with being perplexed because he was dealing in a world that had the science of his day, which he presents to us as the way things are. And we have similar challenges, and we can use his methods, and they're extremely relevant. So don't think that just because this is some Aristotelian idea that's been debunked a long time ago, therefore Maimonides has no relevance to us. You will find as we read through this, and that's why it's crucial to go through the pain of studying Aristotelian philosophical ideas, not because we really agree with these ideas, and we know by now our conception of the world scientifically is so dramatically different. But that's not the point. The point is we need to see how Rambam dealt with this so that we can understand how we can deal with what we have in front of us today. I think that's a crucial point. Now that I made that point, we're going to go into this book, and I took some time to summarize each one of these premises that we're about to study in modern English terms that we can understand, to try to simplify this. So but some of the paragraphs I'll read from the book, and you'll see when I jump in and out, I'll tell you. So the premises needed, here we start. This is the introduction to book 2, to part 2. The premises needed for establishing the existence. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, because my microphone was a little farther away than usual.
Yeah.
The premises needed for establishing the existence of the deity, may he be exalted. That's number 1, right? In other words, that there is a creator. And for the demonstration that he is neither a body nor a force in a body, right? And you'll understand as we go through Rambam why he said that, neither a body nor a force within a body. And that he is one are 25. We need to understand 25 premises in order to understand those basic principles about God. And it's fascinating because these are the 25 principles of physics. It's like literally he sat down and said, today he sat down in class and said, I'm going to teach you Newtonian physics, and we need these principles in order to understand God. That's what Rambam is saying. So let that sink in for a minute. Okay. So for Aristotle, all these 25 have been demonstrated without there being a doubt as to any point concerning them. You can rely on them, at least in Rambam's time. Obviously, since then they have been disproven, but Rambam didn't see any reason why they should be disproven. They're basic. These are the premises. And the reason why he says that is, and he's going to emphasize later, that he's not going to bother going through all the proofs and because there's books and books and books. He'll refer us later to, if you want to read about it, you can. But that demonstrate each one of the premises, he's just saying the 25 conclusions that we have to accept as fact. So these are like the Newtonian equations that are the bottom line of Newtonian physics. And then you would have to use it in order to figure out problems. So these are the bottom line facts. So for Aristotle and the peripatetics after him that have come forward with a demonstration for every one of them, there's one premise that we will grant them, right? For through it the objects of our quest will be demonstrated, as I shall make clear. This premise is the eternity of the world. In other words, and I'm going to use that premise, the idea that the world has always been, that the world wasn't created ex nihilo yesh me'ayin, right? That premise I'm going to have to grant the philosophers just for argument's sake. So assume for a moment that it's okay to express the idea that the world has always been and there wasn't a creator, right? Assume that, or that there wasn't a creator, right? Assume that so that we can go through Aristotle's arguments, and then I will show you later how I veer off that path and conclude that there is a creator. Okay, so it's important to do that. So the first premise. So here we go. All right, and I'm going to try to simplify these things, and I'm going to try to put them in terms that we can understand. The first premise is the existence of any infinite magnitude is impossible. So a magnitude is the way you measure something, right? So you can't say, you can say something is 6 feet tall, that's a measurement of height. You can say it's 200 pounds, that's a measurement of weight. You can say there's 7 million stars, that's a quantitative measurement. So anytime you measure anything, it's impossible for there to be infinite. It can't be infinitely tall. It has to end somewhere. That's the Aristotelian premise number one, okay? And of course, like Rambam tells us, there's books and books and books have been written by Aristotle and his students to prove that. Premise number two, excuse me, is the existence of magnitudes of which the number is infinite as possible. So that means you can't have an infinite number of things, right? So if I tell you there's a table, I can tell you there's 100 tables. I can tell you there's 1,000 tables, but there can't be an infinite amount of tables. There can't be an infinite amount of stars or an infinite. It's impossible. It has to be a certain number. Third premise, okay? And the third premise is there can't be an infinite of causes and effects. What does that mean, right? In other words, if the carpenter is the one who caused my table to come to be, right? And the carpenter's parents caused the carpenter to come to be. And the carpenter's parents caused them to come to be. And then let's say you want to go all the way back to evolution. Everything has a cause that made something come to be. It has to end somewhere. It can't keep going on and on and on and on and on and on and on. There has to be an end, a first cause. It can't go on forever. Causes and effects. So those are my own words. I think they're a lot easier to read than the way Rambam worded it. The fourth premise, and this is an important idea here. And the fourth premise, remember, Rambam is teaching us physics now. So we're getting it, it's as if we just rewound the clock 1,000 years and we registered in Physics 101 in the University of Cairo. And this is what we're learning, okay? The fourth premise, change exists in 4 categories. So there's 4 ways in which a thing can change. And so the 4 ways are as follows. Something can change in substance, right? So the substance of something can change. An animal could die and then it could rot and turn into dirt, right? The substance can change, okay? It can change in quantity, and quantity means size or amount. Like you can have a person, the person can be a child and then grow and be bigger. The person can gain weight and be fatter. A person can lose weight and be skinnier. A person can get older. He can grow a beard or whatever. He can change, right? So I'm sorry, quantity. The beard example wasn't a good one, but it's size or quantity, right? So it can change in quality, right? So the quality is something like it can have been cold and now it's hot. So that's a third type of change. And the fourth type of change is it can change in place. Like I can be sitting here now and I can be in my bedroom tonight, right? So I can change my place. I was now here and later on I'm there. Okay, those are the 4 types of change. So remember that. There's only 4 ways things can change. Okay, top. Number 5, I just turned the page to 236. The 5th premise, and this is interesting because this is going to pop up a bunch, is that every motion is a change and transition from potentiality to actuality. Every time something moves, right, whatever it is that moved, it had the potential to be moved at some point, right? In other words, when I'm sitting here in this chair, I have the potential to get up and walk to my bedroom, right? And when I go walk to my bedroom, I have now changed that potential to something actual. I have now made that motion, right? So, and this is going to be an important principle that's going to pop up a lot. The 6th premise is another important group, and that is that there's 4 different types of motion, okay? And the Rambam calls them the 4 categories in the English translation I'm going to use now are essential, accidental, violent, and part. And it's fascinating because when we think, and I'm far from an expert in modern physics, I stopped after all I needed to study for the MCATs, and then I've forgotten all my physics since then. But it is fascinating if you have even a little bit of education in physics, how you can see how these ideas eventually gave birth to the problems that people like Isaac Newton and Einstein and later physicists were dealing with. So number 1 is essential motion. Essential motion means the natural movement of an object. So the example of that would be a stone falling, right, to the ground, right? That's the natural motion of the stone. Okay, before you know about the force of gravity, you think they were thought of that as an essential motion. It's just the natural motion that it does. That's what it does. The second type of motion is what Rambam calls accidental or mikra. In other words, it happened to something. So you have a rock, right? And I picked up the rock and I moved it from here to there, right? So I made it move, or someone made it move, or an animal comes by and pushes something or whatever, but something made an object move from here to there. And then there's what he calls violent motion. Violent motion is against natural motion. And that would be if I take a rock and I pick it up, right? So its natural motion is to go down, but I lifted it and I pushed it up. That's violent motion. That's where a force takes something and pushes it in the wrong direction, so to speak. And then the fourth one is what the Rambam calls a part motion, excuse me, a partial motion, which is something that would give the idea to relative motion. And his example is of an item on a ship. So if we look at a ship and we see it moving on the water from here to there, right? So everything that's on the ship is also in motion. It's all moving, right? But now, if I take out my binoculars and I look at the ship and I see that on the ship, there's a sailor who's taking a box from one side of the ship and carrying it to the other side, right? So that is nowadays we might use the term a relative motion, because it was moving already, but now it's moving in relation to the ship that's also moving. And that's called what he calls part motion. So that is number 6. I'm sorry, you guys, I know you thought you were coming to a Torah class and you're in a physics class, but that's just the way it goes. And like I explained in the beginning, in the Rambam, that difference didn't exist. This is knowledge. This is truth. You need to learn it. So here goes. Number 7, and that is that anything that's changeable is divisible. So what does that mean? So Rav Kapach and explains this nicely in Hebrew. He explains that the way the Aristotelians came up with this idea is because if, let's say, you have you take a lump of, I don't know, whatever, a person, right, and that person starts to change, right? It's a gradual change. So part of the body changes. Like, let's say you heat up, so it starts on the outside, then it gets deeper and deeper, or you take an item and it starts to change in color, or it starts to get cold, right? It starts somewhere and then it moves in or moves out or moves from top to bottom or right to left or whatever, right? So that means already that one part of it is changing before the other part. So it's obviously divisible. So anything that can change is divisible. You can already hear where this is going, because this is a physics principle, right? And you can hear how when Rambam is going to talk to us about God, how if God cannot change and is not divisible, right? Because he cannot change, it's impossible for him to be divisible. That's just a little sliver. So you're understanding a little how we're going to jump from these physics ideas to ideas about God. Okay. Number 8 is the idea that any motion that's accidental. Remember, there were 4 categories of motion, right? There was one motion that's essential, that's part and parcel of the thing, like the falling rock. And then there was what Rambam called accidental motion, which refers to when I pick up a rock and bring it from this room to that room. So that's accidental motion. Well, if any accidental motion, it has to end at some point. It can't go on forever, right? This is similar to the idea that the Rambam said you can't have anything that's infinite. Because if I pick up a rock from here and then I bring it there, then I bring it there, then I bring it there, at some point it stops and I put it down, right? There has to be an end, right? And that end is when the person or force or thing or whatever it is that's making it move stops, right? The 9th principle, that's number 8. Number 9 is that whoever it is or whatever it is that's doing the moving is also moving, right? So if I am moving the rock, I have to be moving, right? If the wind is blowing a leaf in the wind is moving too, right? It's impossible to conceive of the force that's making the movement make something move without moving itself. That's another principle of Aristotelian physics. Number 10, any quality, okay, this is, it took me a few minutes to understand this, right? Either exists, anything, if you look at someone's body or something that you see in front of you, whether a table, a desk, whatever it is, if it exists, right, any quality of it, it's red, it's hard, it has a certain shape, right? That quality exists because of the body that it exists in, right? If you say it's hard, It's only hard because the table is hard, right? The table has, it wouldn't make sense to, if there was no table, to say that it was hard, right? It's only hard because there's a table that's hard, right? So every quality exists due to the body, or it is the force that makes the body exist. And now here's where, well, actually, we're going to come back to this one a little bit more later when we talk about matter and form, which is the final one of the 25, which is real important. So I'm going to hold off a little bit of discussion on this when I talk about when we talk about chomer and surah, which is the Hebrew terms for matter and form, which is the Aristotelian idea. I think it's called a hylomorphism, is the Aristotelian idea of matter and form. I'll talk about what that means, because that pops up in Torah literature all the time. And it's so different from our concepts of science that it's important for us to understand what they were thinking, so that when we read this in books, any book, especially in the Rambam, we will understand what they're talking about. Because anyway, but we'll get back to that. So number 11, the 11th premise. I'm now on the bottom of page 236. The 11th premise is that qualities that exist because of the body are also divisible, right? Because if I say this table is brown, right? It's divisible, because if I cut the table in half, now I have two tables that are brown. There's a brown table over here, and there's a brown half a table over here, and a brown half a table over there, right? So, however, the quality that make the body exist is not divisible. What's the quality? It's the intellect or the soul, which according to Rambam is synonymous, right? The intellect makes the body be. That cannot be divided. It's inconceivable that there's one Saul Weinreb's brain over here and another half Saul Weinreb's brain. It doesn't work that way. The intellect is one unified thing. Okay. Now, remember, you can agree or disagree with these ideas, right? That's not the point. The point is that in Rambam's day, these were the basics of physics. This was the 25 principles that everybody had to learn when they wanted to know physics. This is what you have to learn. Number 12. Any force that exists within a body, so let it be a soul or something that animates me or you or anyone here, right? It's finite because it's limited by my body. It's only in me, right? It's not in you or you or you. It's not walking out of my house down the road. It's in me, and that's it. That's all it is, okay? And we'll see later, whatever, if the body ceases to exist, well, then maybe it might be different. But right now it's here. So it's finite, just like my body is finite. Now, no motion, that's number 12. Number 13, no motion can be continuous unless it is circular. Okay, that's another principle of Aristotelian physics. Because if you think about anything that has to turn a corner, like that's not that it ends, right? It ends, it changes direction, etc. But something that goes around in circles can continue on and on. So if you have motion that's continuous and doesn't stop, it has to be circular motion. Now you can understand already how that's going to help in understanding the motions of the spheres, which we touched on a few times, and we're going to touch on a lot more as we go through this. If anyone wants to stop me and ask questions about these things, please do so. But let's go through this. The number 15 is, and I'm now on page 237 in the Pines. The 15th premise is as follows, and that is that motion and time are necessary for each other. And this is really important. We're going to see later, and Rama mentioned this a little before, that the concept of time didn't exist before creation, because time only exists in relative to motion, right? If there's no motion, there's no time. If there's no time, there's no motion. And this is something that just made me think of one of the few Newtonian equations that I still remember from Physics 101 in college, and that is that distance equals velocity times time, right? So you can't, they're both in that equation. You can't conceive of that kind of motion without time. Now, maybe in modern physics and theoretical physics, it might be different, but in the physics that we see every day, those rules, those Newtonian rules still hold true. And that is the idea that you cannot conceive of motion without time. So if there is no motion, right, then there is no time. And if there's no time, there is no motion. Fine. That's number 15. Number 16, the 16th Aristotelian idea. And that is that in anything that, remember before I said that my soul is finite as long as it's in me, right? Any force that animates or brings life to something or makes something exist is limited to that thing, right? However, an intellect cannot be counted or divided into parts unless it is associated with either a body, right? So you can count my intellect and your intellect and your intellect, right? Because we're separate people. But if we're not, right, like if it's not associated with the body, you can't count them, right? There's no numbers. There isn't 162,000 souls waiting in a certain box that God has in heaven or something. It doesn't work. You can't count them that way, right? And or you can also count the things that those forces cause, right? You can say it caused 2 thunderstorms, or it caused 25 people to be born, but you can't say that you can't count that. Fine. That's principle number 16, a principle of physics. Okay. I want to jump to 25 like now already. But I don't. I won't. I'll go in the Rambam's order. Because matter and form is so important for us to understand, because we really need to screw on our heads when we learn almost anything, from a Hasidic sefer to like anything, Surah, Homer and Surah, they keep popping up, and to a modern mind, we don't even understand what they're talking about. And I want to explain it to you so that anytime you open a book, a medieval book, you'll know what they're talking about. Okay, but we'll get there. So the next thing is, everything that moves must have a mover, right? Nothing can move on its own, right? The Rambam has a quote here from the no, he quotes it later. I'm trying to remember where. Oh, it's late. He quotes it in a later one. But basically, matter does not move itself. It's later when we talk about matter and form. It's a quote from Aristotle. Matter cannot move itself, right? If matter is moving, there must be something moving it, right? Now, and this is true for all of the types of motion that we said before, even essential motion. Like we talked, essential motion meant the motion that they viewed as natural motion, like a rock falling, right? There still is a force that's making it happen. Something is making that motion happen, right? And Rambam points out, if you have an animal that's walking down, people try to disprove this notion. What do you mean nothing's moving that animal? No, there is. Within the animal, there is a soul that makes that animal move. Within you and me, there is a force of life that says, I want to step outside. I want to go for a walk, right? So the Rambam makes it clear that that's not a disproof, because even within us, there's a force that makes us move. It looks like I'm moving myself, but it's really a force within me that's making my body move. So there's always something making something move. That's number 17. Number 18, anything that changes, right, from potential to actual. Remember, he talked about that in motion, right? If you have something that's sitting here, it's potential, it could be over there. It's just not there yet. When I pick it up and bring it there, that I brought it from potential to actual. So if it changes, it must have some outside force that made it happen. It must have me. I decided to pick up the rock and put it over there, right? If I didn't make that decision and do it, it would still be here, right? So something changes from potential to actual, something has to make that happen. All right. You can start trying to imagine in your mind how all these premises are going to play when Rambam discusses God, and it helps us understand what he means when he discusses concepts of God and so on. But anyway, and that is the point. That's why Rambam is saying all of this, so that you understand, that we understand, what he's talking about, what his language he's using, what he means. So number 19, if something requires a cause for something to exist, right, such as a soul in a body, which is the example that Rambam gives himself, when you take the cause away, then the thing ceases to exist. So you take the soul out of the person, whatever that force that animates a person is, I'm calling it a soul. But remember how Rambam conceives of that, and how other thinkers and philosophers over the ages, and Judaism for sure, think of it as very different. But that's not the point. Whatever you're going to call that force that animates me, if God forbid it left me, I wouldn't be anymore, right? That would be true for all of us. Number 20. And this is that anything that of necessity has to exist on its own. In other words, if you're going to find me something, right? And I bet you guys can figure out right away what this something is, or who this something is, that of necessity exists on its own without anything making it exist. Well, then there has to be no causer that makes that entity exist. Now, guess who that is? That can only be God, right? So if I tell you that God, that if I show you that God exists, right, then you can't tell me that there's something out there that made God exist, right? Because if God has to exist, if logically he has to exist, then it's impossible that anything made him happen. Because if you apply the premise from before, right, there has to be an outside cause, and you take the outside cause away, it ceases to exist. But if something exists without an outside cause, then there can't be an outside cause. All right. Anyway, so that's important. Fine. So that's number 20. Number 21. If something is made, and I'm now on page 238, and if you see that I'm using very different language in Rambam, that's because I'm trying to make it translatable in our century. So,
Can I ask a quick
go ahead.
question?
Sorry.
This last proposition where
Yes.
you said, well, God is the obvious, the 20th premise, is there anything other than God that can possibly relate to this 20th? I mean, the God is
In theory, you might come up with something, but in the actual world, no.
okay.
There is nothing else that has to exist, right? That there has to be, right? And there is nothing else that has no cause causing it, right? And that's the basic Aristotelian idea, which Rambam absolutely subscribes to, and that is that God is the prime mover. He's the one that makes the whole thing go around, right? Now, 21. If something is made of more than two things, like if you find me something and you say, that's made out of, I don't know, whatever. I just had pasta and mushrooms. That's made out of pasta and mushrooms. Okay, so you can't, and so it has to be, right? The cause of the pasta and mushrooms are because pasta got together with mushrooms, right? And I mished them together and I cooked them and I ate them, right? But so in other words, the cause of that's existence. So if anything that you can describe with two descriptors and say, so if you're going to say, if I asked you, and this is crucial because we learned this together in depth, the idea of Rambam's idea that you cannot give attributes to God. If you told me, describe God to me, and you said, oh, well, he's got 13 attributes. He's good, he's kind, he's empathetic, he's patient. Whoops, you just committed a major Maimonidean sin, right? Because you're describing that God has this character and this characteristic, and you put all those together and you get God. Whoa, big problem, red flag, right? Because you just said all of these components make up God, but that can't be, right? Because that means that if you pull those components apart, you don't have God anymore. That's a logical impossibility. And this is fascinating because it's based on principles of modern, and I say modern physics, I mean in Rambam's day, it's impossible to describe God with attributes. He just used a scientific principle to explain that. So as we go through this, you'll understand how profound some of these things are, that he's using science to explain these ideas. So that's number 21. Number 22. I know I jumped the gun a little bit because Rambam here is just laying out the principles, and he's not telling us how he's going to use those principles later. That we're going to get to, but I can't help myself if I jump ahead a little bit because I want to give you a little flavor of why he's doing this, because otherwise it would be really dry. All right, but anyway, number 22. Every single physical thing in the universe is made of parts. So this is where remember, Jeff, you asked before about if there's anything else but God. Well, this principle is that there is nothing else but God, because everything in the physical universe, how do you describe? Find anything. Well, it's made of this, this, and this, right? My salt is made out of sodium and chloride. It gets together, it becomes sodium chloride, and I call it salt, right? The book that's in front of me, it's made out of some paper and some ink and some binding and blah, 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 right? So everything we know, everything that exists, the star, it's made out of this chemical and that this element, that element. Everything we see in the entire universe is made of stuff, and you describe what stuff it's made of. So therefore, there's nothing in this universe that's even remotely comparable to God. Number 23 is I'm going to read from the text here for a minute, because here I liked this text. I'm not using my own. The 23rd premise on the bottom of 238. It is possible for whatsoever is in potentia, and in whose essence there is a certain possibility, not to exist and act to at a certain time. So that means that if you find something that can potentially be, right, it's possible for it to remain in potentia, right? So if I take a seed, a Kapak's example is a date seed, you can plant it, and it has the potential, if you water it properly and you give it the right amount of sun, that it'll grow into a date palm, right? Or if you have a chunk of iron, and if you melt it properly and you put it in a form and you bang it down and you sharpen it, you could turn it into a sword, right? But if you don't do all that stuff, then it'll just stay the way it is, right? So you can have a chunk of matter, and if nobody does anything to it, it'll just stay a chunk of matter, right? But if you do something to it, then you can make it into something else. Okay. And number 24 is whatsoever is the top of page 239. Excuse me. Whatsoever is something in potentia is necessarily endowed with matter. For possibility, it is always in matter. In other words, if I tell you that there's a potential sword somewhere, right? That's because somewhere in the world there's a mine, and in that mine there's iron. And if somebody goes and mines the iron and takes it out and puts it through whatever you got to do to make it into a sword, right? There's a potential sword somewhere in the world, right? But I can't tell you there's a potential sword if there's no matter in the entire universe with which to make a sword. In other words, it doesn't just come from poof, right? If there's potential out there, it's because there's stuff, there's actual matter, there's actual stuff somewhere. Okay. Now's number 25. And this I'm going to explain in my own words, and that's the idea of matter and form. Now, what is matter and form? So matter, I think we understand what matter. Matter is stuff, right? Now, today, you and I hopefully remember, you know, the periodic table of the elements. So we have at least a basic idea, right? But so we know all matter is made up of elements, right? Now, obviously, they had a different understanding. They also had elements, you know, which we learned earlier: earth, fire, water, and wind. But the idea is, though, is that but that's matter. So everything is made of stuff. What form is the thing or the force that makes the matter assemble into the shape that it's in. Okay, so it's bordering on something that's spiritual. But remember, Rambam and Aristotle didn't differentiate, but in the way that you and I sometimes think. We think about spiritual things as being on a different plane. That's not the way that everything is scientific. Everything has laws and rules, and we can understand it. And you have to think that way. So there's a force that turns me into me, right? That makes the Saul Weinreb form and makes me, right? That force, whatever it is, that's tsura, that's form. Okay. So this is it's almost the things that we sometimes might think border on spiritual or whatever. And those in this idea, and the way Aristotle explained the world, and the way Rambam is explaining the world, everything has such a tsura. There is a tsura, there is a force that makes the table a table, right? What gives wood the qualities that make wood wood? It's the tsura of wood. It's this force that makes wood have woodness to it, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind whenever you learn from someone who's writing in medieval times. So up to somewhere, I don't know, in the Sfarim, it's somewhere in the 20th century that a lot of the writers of Sfarim got this idea. But in secular world, it's a little earlier than that, right? But when you see Chomer and Tsura, understand what it means. Okay, Chomer means the stuff, right? And Tsura means that whatever it is that causes that stuff to assemble into the shape and form that we see with our eyes, with the functions and abilities that it has. So now that we said this, so now you can understand, going back before, when the Rambam talked about every item that goes from potential to actual, right? There's something that's making it happen. What is that something? That something is the tsura, right? The tsura, the form, the force that forms it into that. Now, those forces could be a combination of all kinds of forces in the world. And Rambam is going to explain how the motions of the spheres and the planets, and they all mix, and how the natural tendency for fire to go up and matter and soil to go down, it's that they all mix and get mixed in such a way that gives tsura to the objects, okay? Which is a scientific principle. So now that we got this, now I'm going to go back to, so those are the 25 premises. And he's about to talk about number 26. Because number 26 is the big controversial one. And this is the famous place where Rambam, as much as he loved Aristotle, there was one thing that he disagreed on. And that's like one of the most important parts of this entire book. And that is the eternity of the world. So we're going to be talking about that a lot for a while, but here goes. So just a tiny little intro. So the Rambam says, and I'm reading on 239 from the Pines English translation, okay? Of the 25 premises that I have put before you in the form of a preface, some are easy, some become manifest with little reflection. Anyone, you and I, we might not be metaphysicists or physicists, but you can figure them out, right? Like what I told you about motion and time. That makes sense to us, right? You can figure that out. It's pretty basic. Others require a number of demonstrations and premises leading up to them. Others, there's books written on. However, all of them have been given, trust me, they have been given demonstrations as to which no doubt is possible. I'm telling you, these are proven, right? There's no reason you can question these ideas. Trust me, you can. With regard to some of them, you can look in the book of Acroasis and its commentaries. You can look in the book of Metaphysics and its commentary. There's books and books on the books. Just go and look at the book of Acroasis is referring to what's nowadays. If you go online, you can look for Aristotle's book, which is titled Physics. That would be the book he's referring to. Okay. I've already made it known to you. And remember, you here is the guy he's writing this sefer for, his student. Remember, all the way back in the beginning, he had a student he's writing this book to. That the purpose of this treatise is not to transcribe the books of philosophy. I'm not sitting here and writing you a whole library of philosophy books to back up all these ideas and to explain the most remote of the premises, but to mention the proximate ones that are required for our purpose. Sorry if I'm paraphrasing a little bit. However, I shall add to the premises mentioned one more that affirms as necessary the eternity of the world. Aristotle really has a number 26, and that is, he says that the world has always been. The world is eternal. It has always been and always will be, right? So what we see is what we get, and it's what if you walk back 10 million years, you would have seen the same thing, okay? So Aristotle deemed it to be correct and the most fitting to be believed. We shall grant him this premise by way of a hypothesis in order that the clarification of that which we intended to make clear should be achieved. I'm going to accept it for argument's sake as we go through the further discussions, his idea that the world is eternal, right? This premise, which among them is the 26th, which is the 26th out of the 25 that I mentioned, that time and movement are eternal, perpetual, existing in action. In other words, they're not potential, but all this motion that we see is the same motion that's going to keep on going, and it's the same motion that always been going. Hence, it follows of necessity, in his opinion, that there is a body moving with an eternal movement, and this is the fifth body, right? And in other words, if it's always moving, then there is something that's always moving it, right? Remember, we said that rule. The premise was that anything that moves must have something moving it, right? For this reason, he says that heaven is not subject to generation and corruption. That's why what Aristotle calls the fifth body, right, which is the God, the deity, right, the one that's moving it all, right, can't be something that changes because it's always going the same. Not like everything else in the world that has to stop at some point, right? But the God is always going round and round and round, right? Because remember, round is the continuous motion, which is why when you look up at the sky in their mind, everything's always going round, right? For according to him, movement is not subject to generation and corruption. For he says that every movement is necessarily preceded by another movement, either of the same species or of another species. And that what is thought with regard to living beings, that their local movement is not preceded by another, is not correct. Right? For the cause of their movement after rest goes back finally to things calling for this local movement. Wait, I'm sorry. I skipped. No, I didn't skip anything. I apologize. These things being either an alteration of temperament necessitating the desire to seek, but I'm going to skip a little bit here. Accordingly, any one of these three factors sets the living being in motion, and every one of them is necessitated by other movements. So, when a person moves, and I mentioned this before, that people argue about, what do you mean everything needs something else to make it move? What about a person who moves? Well, no, a person moves because something within him decides, I'm hungry, I'm going to go eat. Or there's a lion chasing me, I need to run, right? So something makes you do something, but it's inside you, there's something that makes that happen. So similarly, he says that in the case of everything that comes about in time, the possibility of its coming about precedes in time its coming about. So So from this, there follow necessarily several points liable to validate his premise. So according to this premise, a finite moving object moves upon a finite distance an infinite number of times, going back over the same distance in a circle. So you have an object, which we said can't be infinite. It has to be a certain amount. It can't be infinitely large, which moves a certain amount of distance, because we said that it's nothing, but it does it over and over and over again. It just keeps going round and round and round and round. Now, this is impossible except in circular movement, as is demonstrated in the 13th of the premise. So now, this is the premise, and I'm reading the second paragraph, and this is going to end this chapter and today's lecture. This is the premise that Aristotle constantly wishes to establish as true. He's constantly pushing for the eternity of the world. And this is obviously the big thing that bothers Rambam. We get to, I think it's chapter 13, where he just says, even though you can argue with Aristotle back and forth, and I can prove, and he can prove, and they can prove, and we all can sit and argue, the Rambam says, it's not true. I know Aristotle is wrong, because nothing would make sense. Like the whole purpose of the world just wouldn't make sense if everything just kept on going, if it was eternal. There had to have been a creation that created everything with a reason. And when the Rambam says that, he says it with such a power of passion. I'm giving you again, I'm making spoilers, right? But it's like I can scientifically accept that maybe he's right, but I can't accept that he's right, because the whole world would have no purpose if that was the case, is essentially what Rambam was going to eventually argue. In other words, he's going to demonstrate a very rational and scientifically valid, and when I say scientifically valid, I mean according to Rambam and his science approach, that demonstrates that it doesn't have to be eternal, right? But then he'll admit that I don't know if I'm right or he's right, but I know I'm right because of what I just said, because it has to be, right? And we'll get there, right? Because he says the entire Torah would make no sense otherwise, right? Like, why should we be good? Why should we do anything? It just wouldn't make any sense. So the premise in question is rather, in his opinion, the most fitting and the most probable. No, I'm sorry. Now to me, I skipped a sentence that's important. The second sentence in the second paragraph on 240. To me, it seems that he does not affirm categorically that the arguments he puts forward in favor constitute a demonstration. This is amazing. Rambam is saying, when I read Aristotle, I think that he himself realized that he can't prove 100% that the world is eternal, right? And he realized that all the other premises he can prove. But this one, I think Aristotle himself knew, because Rambam wants to say, he doesn't want to go up against Aristotle if Aristotle was absolutely certain. So he'd rather say that Aristotle himself wasn't even certain. However, his followers and commentaries on his book, they thought that Aristotle thought that he meant it for sure. In other words, that this was an absolute principle. I know, Rambam says, I admit that that's what Aristotle wrote and that's what he held, but I also think that Aristotle realized that his arguments weren't solid. We're going to get into that into a lot more detail. On the other hand, the Mutakalim, the guys that we learned last week, right, they say they desire to establish that it is impossible, right? They want to prove that he's completely wrong, right? And Rambam already dealt with their proofs and knocked them all out the window, right? That's what he did. They say there can be no mental representation of the coming about in succession of an infinite number of things occurring in time. It can't just keep on going and going and going and going forever. The strength of their argument is that it constitutes, in their opinion, at first intelligible. But to me, it seems that the premise in question is possible. In other words, it could be that Aristotle is right? That is neither necessary as affirmed by the commentaries of the writings of Aristotle. In other words, it's not absolutely proven like the people that follow Aristotle claim. But on the other hand, it is also not impossible like the Mutakalim claim. So Aristotle's logic could be right, but it's not. It is not now the purpose to explain the arguments of Aristotle or to raise our doubts or to explain my opinion of the creation, because we're going to do that, right? But the purpose at this point is to circumscribe the premises that we need for our three problems. Remember our three problems, that there is a creator and there was a creation. That's one, right? The fact, once you say there's a yesh me'ayin, it means that there was a being, namely a God, a deity that made it happen. Number two, that he is one. And number three, that he does not have a body. Okay, so I just wanted to lay out the premises so that we can use them to prove prove those three ideas. After first having set forth these premises and having agreed to take them as granted, now that you can take these as granted, I shall set out explaining what necessarily follows from them. And now he's going to use those to explain all kinds of things. So that is the introduction to chapter 2. And I'm as we go through the Rambam's proofs and stuff, these ideas, these premises will start becoming second nature to you. They'll start becoming like facts, right? Whether they're scientifically correct in modern days. And as we go through it, I want you to think hard. As you start developing and understanding the way the Rambam takes physics, science, and uses it as he tries to navigate his way to establish basic Torah principles, right? How we should deal the same way today. In other words, obviously, I'm not going to talk to you about, these 25 principles today. We have a very different science, but the method that he uses is extremely relevant and extremely important. So I'm going to stop here and open the floor for questions. But you got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a simple. If we go back to number 3,
okay,
third premise, and we're starting with an assumption that the eternity of the world, he says the existence of causes and effects of which the number of infinite is impossible. And it goes, for example, there's a particular intellect that causes cause second intellect, cause the second, third, and third, fourth, and so on to infinity.
Right.
Well, doesn't this undermine the idea of the eternity of the world? Because what's the cause of the world unless how do you dig out of that?
Well, both according to Aristotle and according to Rambam, that remains true, because all the cause and effect goes back until you get to God, right? And both according to Aristotle and Rambam, God is the end or the beginning, depending on which direction you're going, right?
Well,
so it's not infinite.
Well, what's the cause of God?
Nothing, because God is the only thing that has to exist on his own.
Okay.
So there is no cause for God, which is why, right. And God is the only entity for which there is no cause.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. That's good that you brought that up, because it helped bring out that idea, because it's important to remember. Any other comments? If there aren't, go ahead, please.
Would you say that, take an example from modern chemistry, organic chemistry.
Okay.
You can create virtually an unlimited number of elements. Not that has been done yet, but I'm sure hundreds or thousands of new ones are created every year by organic chemists. Does that?
Well, I don't know if they take that many more elements. I think maybe more molecules, but
compounds.
Elements.
The compounds.
Compounds. Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
it's not technically infinite. It's probably gazillion, I don't know, billions to billions to billions of, but of different possibilities, but it's not infinite, right? I don't know how the number is extremely large.
You can just add another carbon onto the end of a polymer and create a new element. So basically, it's just like.
Well, at some point you'll run out of carbons in the world and the universe, right? I don't know how many carbon molecules there is in the entire universe.
Yeah.
Get a number we can't even comprehend. But at some point you'll be done with all the carbons, and that'll be it.
Okay. Yeah, there is a finite number of
right. Yeah, exactly. So you can talk to astrophysicists, might be able to give you an estimate, but it's a big number. It won't fit on your page, that's for sure. But anyway, any other questions or comments or observations?
Is that the entire second volume? Is the entire volume we're looking at a derivative of these 25 principles, or do we get to other topics in here?
Oh, Rambam in his usual way bounces around, as you know, right? He does that all the time. Okay. He deliberately does that, As soon as he gets to something will get really juicy, and then all of a sudden he'll say it in a cryptic, esoteric way, and then all of a sudden he'll jump on to another side. It's as we've seen until now, But remember these things. It might seem a little difficult now, but it won't. You'll see as we go through it. You'll start seeing how he thinks, and you'll start learning, how he would apply any knowledge to, and how he would reconcile differences that seem to happen when you start learning the Torah, right? And that's really what the purpose of this book is. Rambam was dealing with, this was his physics, right? And he was trying to figure out how this meshes, how this jives with Torah. And to him, it's not considered a conflict. The truth needs to be one unified thing. It all has to make sense together. And that's what he's trying to do here. And he's going to teach us how to do it. And you'll see, if you stick with it, it'll work. You'll get it. Okay. All right.
Great class.
All right. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Looking forward to next week. Bye.
Good.